My brother took everything, but stealing the family inheritance revealed secrets that changed everything. Growing up, my older brother, Jake, was always the center of attention. It wasn't something anyone outright said, but I could feel it in the way our parents looked at him, the way they celebrated every little thing he did. He was their golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one in the background, trying to make sense of why no matter what I did, it never seemed to measure up. It started when we were kids. Jake got the better toys, the bigger slices of cake, and when it came time for birthdays or Christmas, his gifts always seemed more thoughtful, more expensive. I tried to rationalize it. He was older, so of course he got the cooler stuff, but as the years went by, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I remember one summer when Dad bought a new bike. There was no question about who it was for. Jake got to pick it out, and I got his hand-me-downs, always a size too big, always a bit worn from the way he treated things like they were disposable. No matter how many times I asked for something of my own, the response was always the same: wait until you're Jake's age. But the thing is, even when I did get to his age, the waiting never stopped. The real sting came when it was about more than just toys and bikes. Jake was the one our parents showered with praise, the one who excelled at sports, got into a top-tier college, and eventually, landed a high-paying job right out of school. I, on the other hand, was the quiet kid who kept my head down, working hard but never quite standing out. It seemed like no matter how hard I tried, I was always living in his shadow. As adults, it didn't get any better. Jake was the one our parents leaned on, the one they trusted with everything. I always thought it was because he lived closer, had his life more together. But deep down, I knew it went beyond proximity. He had always been their favorite, and nothing I did would ever change that. When our parents passed, I assumed things would finally be different. I wasn't expecting much, just my fair share of the estate, maybe a chance to prove that I could handle responsibility too. But when the will was read, it felt like a final confirmation of everything I had feared growing up. Jake got everything. The house, the money, the business assets, all of it. And what did I get? A handful of personal items, sentimental things that were nice but held little real value. It was as if my entire childhood had been distilled into a single moment of being passed over, once again, for my brother. I sat there in the lawyer's office, my hands clenched into fists, trying to hold back the anger that was bubbling up inside me. Jake, sitting next to me, barely glanced in my direction. He didn't need to. He had won, just like he always did. In the days following the reading of the will, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. It wasn't just about the money or the house, though, God knows, I could have used both. It was about what it symbolized. My entire life, I had been the afterthought, the runner-up, and now, even in death, my parents had made it painfully clear, Jake was their chosen one. I tried to keep my anger in check, but it wasn't easy. Every time I saw Jake, it felt like a fresh wound being reopened. He acted like nothing had changed, like the inheritance wasn't a big deal, but I knew better. This was his final victory, the culmination of a lifetime of always getting the best, of always being the one who mattered most. He didn't even bother to check in on me after the will was read. No phone call, no text, not even a half-hearted apology. I wasn't expecting much. Jake wasn't exactly known for his emotional intelligence, but some small acknowledgement that I existed would have been nice. Instead, he went straight to work, meeting with real estate agents to put the house on the market and financial planners to manage his new windfall. Meanwhile, I was left to sort through my parents' things, trying to find some semblance of closure in the boxes of old photos and letters they had left behind. It was during one of these late nights, sifting through their personal belongings, that I stumbled upon something unexpected. I had been searching for a set of letters my mother had written to her sister years ago, but tucked inside an old photo album was something far more shocking: a second will. At first, I thought it was some kind of draft, a rough outline of what would eventually become the final document. But as I read through it, my heart started to race. This will was different. In this version, everything was split evenly between Jake and me: the house, the money, the business assets. It was exactly what I had expected, what I had believed was fair. Why hadn't this will been read? Why had the lawyer never mentioned it? The more I thought about it, the more it didn't add up. My parents were meticulous people, not the kind to forget updating their legal documents. Something was off, and the only person who would have known enough about the will to tamper with it was Jake. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were all there. Jake had been deeply involved in our parents' affairs, handling everything from their medical decisions to their finances in the final years of their lives. He would have had access to everything, including the will. And now that I thought about it, there had been moments, small clues, where he had hinted at knowing more than he let on. Casual comments about the estate, about how things would work out for him in the end. Suddenly, it all made sense. Jake had taken everything once again, not because he deserved it, but because he had manipulated the situation to his advantage, just like he had always done. I felt my anger flare up, more intense than before. This wasn't just another instance of Jake getting the better deal. This was calculated. This was theft. I couldn't sit with the information for long. The anger fueled me into action, and before I knew it, I was calling the lawyer's office, demanding an explanation. The lawyer, Mr. Hoffman, was an old family friend, and while he sounded surprised by my call, I could hear the hesitation in his voice as I told him what I had found. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," he said carefully. "The will I presented was the only one your parents filed with us." "There's another will, Hoffman," I shot back, pacing the room. "I found it in their house. And it's very different from the one you read to us." Silence. "I'll need to look into that," he said finally, his voice tight. "If you can bring me the document, I'll review it, but I'll need to verify its authenticity." I hung up, my heart pounding in my chest. It was clear Hoffman knew something he wasn't letting on. Jake had to be involved in this. It wasn't the first time he'd used his charm and influence to get what he wanted, and I had a sick feeling in my gut that this time, he'd crossed a line even he couldn't come back from. The next time I saw Jake, it was at the family estate. He had been overseeing the clearing of the house, getting it ready to sell. When I walked in, he barely looked up from the papers he was signing. "Hey," he said casually, as if everything was fine, as if he hadn't just stolen my birthright out from under me. "How's it going?" I couldn't hold it in anymore. "How long did you think you could get away with it?" Jake frowned, finally setting his papers aside. "What are you talking about?" "The will," I said, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. "The real will. The one you hid from me." For the first time in as long as I could remember, I saw Jake's confident mask falter. His eyes flicked to the side, just for a second, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew. "You found it," he muttered, almost to himself. "Yes," I said, stepping closer. "And now, everyone else is going to find out too." Jake stood up, his face hardening. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." "Oh, I think I do," I shot back, my hands shaking. "You've taken everything from me my entire life. But not this time. Not anymore." Jake's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The silence between us stretched on, thick with tension, until I finally turned and walked out of the house, leaving him standing alone in the family home he had tried to claim as his own. I left the family estate that day, my head spinning with a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. I had confronted Jake, and for the first time in my life, I had gotten under his skin. But it wasn't enough. Confronting him was one thing, but proving what he had done, that would be an entirely different battle. I couldn't let this go. The will I found was legitimate, and deep down, I knew Jake had tampered with things to cut me out. But how do you prove something like that? Jake had always been careful, always one step ahead, always playing the long game. I needed help, someone who could dig into the details without getting emotionally involved. That night, I called up an old friend of the family, someone I hadn't spoken to in years but who I knew could help, Michael, a former lawyer who had gotten out of the game after some high-profile cases had drained him. He and I had always gotten along, and more importantly, I knew I could trust him. When I explained the situation to him over the phone, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "This sounds complicated," he said finally. "But if you're serious about pursuing it, I can take a look. I'll need to see the will you found, and I'll have to check with some of my contacts to see if anything was filed improperly." "I'm serious," I said. "I'm not letting Jake get away with this." A few days later, I met Michael at his small office downtown. It was a far cry from the big, polished firms he used to work for, but that wasn't what mattered to me. I handed over the will I had found, and he took it from me with a nod, already flipping through the pages with an expert's eye. "You sure your parents didn't mention this to anyone else?" he asked, looking up from the papers. "A second will is unusual, but not unheard of. They might have told someone about it, another lawyer, a financial advisor, someone close to the family." I thought back to those last years of my parents' lives. They had been private people, but not secretive. If they had made any changes to their will, they wouldn't have kept it from us, or so I thought. "I don't know," I admitted. "But something doesn't add up. Why would they make two wills and not tell me? Why would the lawyer only have one version?" Michael leaned back in his chair, considering. "It's possible Jake had access to their records, especially if he was helping with their finances. If he wanted to hide something, he could have." My heart sank at the confirmation of what I had suspected all along. "So what now?" "Now, we investigate," Michael said. "I'll pull the records on their estate, see if there's anything missing or inconsistent. And I'll reach out to some contacts who specialize in wills and probate. If there's something shady going on, we'll find it." Over the next few weeks, Michael worked behind the scenes, digging through financial records, old legal filings, and even speaking to some of my parents' former advisors. Meanwhile, I did my best to keep a low profile, avoiding Jake whenever possible. I didn't want him to know I was building a case against him until I had all the pieces in place. But staying away from Jake wasn't easy. Our family, as fractured as it was, still had obligations. There were meetings with the estate planners, decisions to be made about selling the house, and endless paperwork to sort through. Every time I saw him, my anger flared up again, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to play this smart. One day, about a month after I had found the second will, Michael called me with news. "I found something," he said, his voice sounding both triumphant and cautious. "Your parents' financial records show that they made a significant payment to a second attorney a few years before they died, someone outside of their usual legal counsel." "What does that mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "It means they were likely working with another lawyer on estate planning," Michael explained. "It's possible that this second attorney drafted the will you found, but for some reason, it was never properly filed." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. So, Jake could have intercepted it? Changed things before it was made official? "It's possible," Michael said carefully. "But I can't say for sure. What I can do is contact this second attorney and ask about the will. If he remembers anything, we might have a case to reopen the estate." A week later, Michael had arranged a meeting with the second attorney, Mr. Randall, a soft-spoken, meticulous man who had clearly dealt with more than his fair share of estate disputes. When we sat down in his small, cluttered office, I could tell he remembered my parents well. "I handled their estate for a brief time," Randall explained. "They came to me when they were thinking about restructuring their will, making sure everything was divided equally between their two sons. But after a few meetings, they stopped coming by. I assumed they had decided to stick with their previous lawyer." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Did they ever finalize the second will with you?" Randall paused, frowning slightly. "We drafted a final version, but it was never officially filed with the courts. They said they were going to think about it, and I never heard from them again." Michael exchanged a glance with me, and I could tell we were both thinking the same thing. Jake had intervened, somehow. He had stopped my parents from filing the will and taken control of everything. I clenched my fists under the table. "Is there anything you can do to help us?" Randall looked thoughtful. "If you have a copy of the will, and if we can prove it was what your parents intended, we could challenge the current estate. It won't be easy, though. Without official filing, it's going to be Jake's word against yours." I nodded, my resolve hardening. "I don't care how hard it is. I'm not letting Jake get away with this." Leaving Randall's office, I felt a mix of hope and anger. Hope that I might finally have a way to right the wrongs of the past, and anger that Jake had gone to such lengths to take what wasn't his. The pieces were starting to come together, but there was still so much to do. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Jake. "We need to talk. Now." Jake's message buzzed in my pocket, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. "We need to talk. Now." It wasn't like him to reach out so directly, especially after the tension between us had boiled over. I could only imagine what he wanted, but whatever it was, I knew it wasn't going to be good. I stared at the message for a few moments before typing back, "Fine." "Where?" His reply came quickly. "Meet me at the house. The old place. 1 hour." The house. The family estate that we were supposed to be selling. I hadn't been back since our last confrontation, and the idea of meeting Jake there alone didn't sit well with me. But I didn't have much of a choice. If he was reaching out now, it meant he knew something. Maybe he had found out about my meeting with Randall. Maybe he was panicking, realizing that the game he thought he had won wasn't over yet. I glanced at my watch and realized I didn't have much time to prepare. I texted Michael, letting him know I was going to meet Jake and where. His response was immediate and concerned. "Be careful. Don't let him corner you." Easier said than done, I thought, as I made my way to the estate. When I pulled up to the house, the driveway was empty except for Jake's car. The sprawling home loomed before me, its windows dark and cold. The house had always felt imposing, even as a kid, but now it seemed more like a tomb, a place full of ghosts and unresolved conflicts. I stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath as I approached the front door. It was ajar, and I could hear footsteps inside. Jake was already waiting. I pushed open the door, and there he was, standing in the center of the living room. He looked different this time, tense, his normally cool and confident demeanor replaced by something darker. His eyes locked onto mine as I entered, and I could feel the weight of whatever was coming hanging between us. "You've been busy," Jake said, his voice low and steady, but there was a sharpness to it that hadn't been there before. "You could say that," I replied, trying to keep my tone calm. "And you?" His lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I've heard some things. People talking. You've been snooping around, meeting with lawyers. I didn't flinch. I had to. You left me no choice. Jake took a slow, deliberate step forward. Is that right? You think you can come after me? After everything I've done for this family, for you? Everything you've done? I scoffed, the anger rising in my chest. You mean everything you've taken? You've always taken whatever you wanted, Jake, and now you've crossed the line. He laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. You're delusional. You've always been jealous. Always the victim, right? Poor little brother, never getting what he thinks he deserves. I stepped closer, my hands clenched into fists. This isn't about jealousy. This is about what's fair. You stole the inheritance, Jake. You manipulated the will, and you know it. Jake's expression hardened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something like fear in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by cold, calculated anger. You don't know what you're talking about, he said through gritted teeth. There was no second will. There's no proof of anything. You're grasping at straws. I found it, Jake, I shot back, my voice steady now. I found the will, and I've spoken to the lawyer who drafted it. You tried to bury it, but you didn't do a good enough job. His face went pale for just a split second before his jaw tightened. He stepped even closer, so close I could smell the faint scent of whiskey on his breath. You don't want to do this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You think you can win, but you don't know what you're up against. I stared him down, refusing to back away. I know exactly what I'm up against. You. For a long, tense moment, we stood there in silence, the air between us thick with years of resentment and unresolved anger. Jake's eyes narrowed, and for a second, I thought he might lunge at me. But then, just as quickly, he turned away, pacing to the far side of the room. You think you can beat me, he muttered, his back to me now. You've always been weak. Always. I'm not weak, I said, my voice firm. Not anymore. Jake stopped pacing and turned back to me, his face twisted in a mixture of frustration and something darker. You really don't get it, do you? This is more than just money. More than just some family squabble. There's more at stake here than you realize. What are you talking about? I asked, narrowing my eyes. Jake shook his head, running a hand through his hair. You wouldn't understand. You never did. You always thought everything was so black and white. But the truth is, sometimes you have to make hard choices. You have to do things that people like you wouldn't understand. I understand enough, I said. I understand that you lied, cheated, and stole to get what you wanted. And now, it's going to catch up with you. Jake's eyes darkened, and for the first time, I saw real fear in them. Not fear of me, but fear of losing control. Fear of losing everything he had built. You don't want to go down this road, he said quietly. I'm warning you. I stepped closer, meeting his gaze head on. And I'm warning you. I'm not backing down. Not this time. As I walked out of the house, my heart was pounding in my chest. The confrontation had been more intense than I had anticipated, but I had stood my ground. I knew Jake was hiding something bigger than just the will, and I was determined to find out what it was. The next day, I met with Michael to go over the confrontation. He listened carefully, nodding as I explained the conversation, the way Jake had tried to intimidate me. He's scared, Michael said thoughtfully. That's a good sign. It means we're getting close to something he doesn't want us to find. What do you think he's hiding? I asked, leaning forward. Michael paused, then leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. It's hard to say. But whatever it is, it's enough to make him desperate. We need to keep digging. I'll follow up with some contacts, see if we can get more information. In the meantime, you need to be careful. Careful? I raised an eyebrow. Jake's not exactly the type to get violent. No, Michael agreed, but desperation makes people do crazy things. Just keep your guard up. This isn't over yet. I left Michael's office feeling both anxious and emboldened. Jake was on the ropes, but whatever he was hiding, I knew it wasn't going to come out without a fight. And if he thought he could scare me off, he was dead wrong. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to all of this, something I wasn't seeing yet. Jake's cryptic words about hard choices and more at stake echoed in my mind, and I knew I was on the brink of uncovering a truth that would change everything. The days after my confrontation with Jake were a blur of tension and anticipation. Michael had promised to keep digging, but the waiting was eating away at me. Every day that passed without new information felt like Jake was winning. But I held on to the hope that we were close to something big, something that would bring him down once and for all. It was a week later when Michael finally called. His voice was steady, but I could hear the excitement beneath it. I found something, he said. Meet me at my office. Now. When I arrived, Michael was already waiting for me with a thick stack of documents spread across his desk. He didn't waste any time. "This is it," he said, tapping the top sheet. "I went through your parents' financial records again, and I found a series of transfers. They're small, almost unnoticeable unless you're looking for them. But they were regular, and they all went to a private account in Jake's name." My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of transfers?" Michael glanced up at me, his expression serious. "They started a few years before your parents passed. Payments from their estate, routed through a third-party shell company that Jake set up. He was siphoning money, bit by bit, making it look like legitimate expenses." I felt the blood drain from my face. "He was stealing from them?" Michael nodded. "It's worse than that. The shell company he used was tied to a series of shady investments. High-risk ventures that could have tanked their entire estate. If your parents had found out, it would have destroyed everything." I stared at the documents, my mind racing. This was it. This was the leverage I needed to finally bring Jake down. He hadn't just manipulated the will, he had been stealing from our parents for years, putting their entire legacy at risk to fund his own ambitions. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "We file a formal complaint with the probate court. With this evidence, we can challenge the will and reopen the estate. Jake will have no choice but to face the consequences." That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was buzzing with the weight of what was about to happen. I had dreamed of this moment for so long, the moment I would finally get justice, finally make Jake pay for everything he had taken. But now that it was within reach, I felt something else too, something I hadn't expected. Fear. Fear of what this would mean for our family, for the legacy my parents had left behind. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to let Jake win. Not this time. The next week was a whirlwind of legal filings and court proceedings. Michael was relentless, pushing forward with the evidence we had gathered, and I stood by his side through every step. Jake, of course, fought back with everything he had. He denied everything, claiming the transfers were legitimate, that he had been managing our parents' finances with their full knowledge and consent. But the more he fought, the more desperate he became. And the more desperate he became, the more cracks started to show in his carefully constructed facade. The day we faced each other in court was the longest day of my life. I sat across from Jake, watching as he tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew he was losing control. He knew the truth was coming out. Michael presented our case with precision, laying out the financial records, the fraudulent transfers, the hidden shell company. Piece by piece, he dismantled Jake's defense until there was nothing left for him to hide behind. When it was finally Jake's turn to speak, he tried to spin the story, painting himself as the responsible son who had taken on the burden of managing the estate while I had been too distracted with my own life to care. But his words rang hollow. The evidence was too strong, and the truth was too damning. By the end of the day, the judge had seen enough. Jake's control over the estate was revoked, and the will was reopened for review. I had won. After the hearing, I stepped outside the courthouse, the weight of the past few months finally lifting from my shoulders. The sky was overcast, but the air felt fresh and cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension that had hung over me for so long. I heard footsteps behind me, and when I turned, there was Jake. He looked different now, defeated, broken in a way I had never seen before. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the years of rivalry, resentment, and bitterness hanging between us like a cloud. "You happy now?" he asked, his voice low and bitter. "You got what you wanted?" I looked at him, the brother who had always been larger than life, always the golden child, always taking what he wanted. And now, here he was, stripped of everything. But instead of the satisfaction I had expected, all I felt was emptiness. "It wasn't about winning," I said quietly. "It was about what was right." Jake's eyes flashed with anger. "Right? You think this was about right and wrong? You don't know what it's like, being the one who has to take care of everything, being the one who has to make the hard choices. You never had to." I shook my head. "You didn't have to do it alone. You chose to. And you chose to betray everyone in the process." He clenched his jaw, looking away, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But instead, he just sighed, the fight draining out of him. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice barely audible. "But it's too late now." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The damage was done, and the path Jake had chosen was one he would have to walk alone. In the weeks that followed, I worked with Michael and the court to restore the estate to its rightful state. The assets were divided fairly, just as my parents had intended, and for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of closure. Jake, on the other hand, disappeared from my life. I heard rumors that he had moved away, trying to start fresh somewhere far from the family he had once betrayed. Part of me wished things could have been different, that we could have found a way to reconcile. But some wounds run too deep. As I stood in front of the family estate for the last time, ready to sign the papers to sell the house, I felt a strange mix of emotions. This house had been the center of so much pain, so much conflict. But it had also been the place where we had once been a family, before everything had gone wrong. I took one last look at the house, the memories of my childhood flashing through my mind. And then, with a deep breath, I turned away, ready to move forward with my life, leaving the past, and Jake, behind.